an interesting expansion of our awareness coming up now, because most of us here are very focused on what's happening in the United States. But the things we're talking about, the expansion of consciousness in the legal profession, are going on all over the world. And it just turns out that we have two people with us, one by Skype and one in person, who can tell us about developments in other countries that are really paralleling what's happened here. Virginia Warren flew 24 hours from Australia to be here. She's a partner in a major law firm in Victoria, but perhaps even more relevant, she is a yoga teacher, which has led her to an understanding of consciousness, and she now works with lawyers in expanding their consciousness. And she has written a book, which I think she's going to tell you about. So keep eating, and we'll listen to Virginia for a few minutes, and then we're going to hear from a representative from Great Britain who's watching patiently. Okay. Yes, I think you can. Mothiur, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes. Hi. Hi, everyone.
Yeah, hello everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. No? Little louder. Okay, how do we do that? On the side here? Okay. That's okay, I'll hold the mic. That's easy for everyone. Oh, okay. There it goes. Hello everyone, my name is Virginia Warren. Hello. Thank you for your warm welcome. It's lovely to be here and actually meet all these people in person. I'm normally speaking to people by technology, Skype and things, so I'm really excited to be over here. 24-hour flight, yes. I hope my brain catches up with me shortly. I'm still half asleep. It's probably 3 o'clock in the morning where I'm from. Yeah, I'm in Mornington Peninsula, which is below Melbourne. I don't know whether any of you to Melbourne. Yes, it's a beautiful place on the planet. I'm blessed to live there. But it's gorgeous here in Washington, D.C. I've been here before, and it's a beautiful city. It was very nice weather yesterday. Tropical D.C. Okay, so I am a yoga teacher as well. I hold a diploma in yoga teaching. When I accidentally fell into yoga, my leopard heels betrayed me one day, and down I went. Down to my knees, my chiropractor sent me off to yoga as therapy for my knees and my ego. And so I fell in love with yoga, the first class. But yoga actually took me to a deeper place and opened a portal to a whole new realm on consciousness and finding out who I am. That was something else. So it's not, with yoga, I went back into my practice of law with yoga in mind, and the principle of non-harm. It was very hard for me to reconcile in law. I felt like there was harm everywhere I went. So I thought what I would do is go a little bit deeper into the spiritual realm, and I studied all sorts of spiritual philosophies for the last 7 or so years. And the underlying theme was fairly the same throughout most of these philosophies. And one, though, struck me in particular as how I could sort of bring law and spirituality together. And that was shamanism. And this was mainly from a perspective of how the shamans dealt with community problems. We have elders, and we have the community, and we have an offender, if you like, whoever was not performing well in their community. And we'd all get together in a group. The important thing here for me was everybody in that group, in that community group, is responsible for the behaviour of this person that's the so-called offender. And it's from that point I got really excited. And I thought, wow, this is something, we are all responsible for each other. It's the connection. It's the whole connection. So if something is going wrong with my community, it's my problem to do with me. In Australia, we have some models that are working well with our Indigenous people. Recently, we have a family court judge, she's retired now, Honourable Oliver Sexton, and she set up a court for Indigenous people. Indigenous people don't like going to court. They feel that in the family system that their children will be taken off of them, which is appalling. You know, that they can't see any justice because of that fear. Also, they fear that they'll go to prison. So that's a really big problem for them. So what she decided to do was step down from the bar table, step down from the bench onto the bar table with elders around her, Indigenous elders, members of the community family, the lawyers, and they resolve issues that way as a community base. And it's marvellous. It's a marvellous way of doing things because everyone had a say in what was going on. This is also happening in our courts of first instance in Victoria, the Koori Court, and that's for the Koori people of Victoria, the Indigenous people. They have it on for criminal matters. So it's the same thing. The judge gets down at the bar table, there's an oval table in this case, elders, Aboriginal elders to either side, and we have community members of the Indigenous community all around them, and they all make a joint decision about what's to happen with the offender. And as a result, recidivism has decreased. So that's just a marvellous thing as well. For our non-Indigenous people, however, we don't seem to have any similar models, and that bothers me. Except we do have our collaborative law, thanks to Stu Webb. That's a beautiful system in our country now. It's growing. We need to get more lawyers involved in that, and hopefully I can do something about that as well. But the problem seems to me that, which you all probably understand, is that we still operate on a win-lose model. That's how the public perceive our legal system, and this is in Australia I'm talking about. So we're not liked at all. And when someone comes to see me and I've got, beautiful pictures of the Buddha sitting in my office, people are like, you're so different. It's like, yeah, you're a human, I'll treat you as a human. And that's really important. And so this beautiful conference here is about fostering human connection in the era of alien nations. The question that I then asked was, where did we lose our connection? So I went to do some shadow work, and I'm trained in shadow work as well, because I found the notion of the human shadow fascinating. What happens is we're born, as we all know, as perfect individuals, beautiful human creatures. We feel, we don't have to ask for our needs to be met. They are. It just simply happens that way. Then we grow up. And as we grow up, we slowly decide, okay, I won't be angry, I won't be sad. That doesn't fit in with the model of my family. That's unacceptable here to develop. I'll be good. Based on someone else's definition. We then repress certain aspects of ourselves, certain emotions. We are no longer becoming a whole person. We're clouding our heart. Our hearts are getting covered over. So with shadow work, and I've got to keep it brief today because I can talk for hours about it, is basically with the human shadow, we'll see it as inner conflict. So when your mind chatter is going on, that's your human shadow talking. The first thing you get up and think about in the morning. If it's not a good thing, it's your shadow. It's an interesting concept. And usually another telltale sign that our shadow is really in force is what's going on externally to us. What you see as a drama in some situations. And this is going back to the shamans again, which you said, it's my problem. The problems around me are my problem. It always comes back to ourselves. The shamans originally called this soul loss, fragmentation. Then, of course, Carl Jung, he developed the human shadow. He was the one that coined the phrase and worked with that as time went on. And he's like a person I really admire and follow for this work. So what I'm trying to achieve is we can see that when a shadow is formed, that's an inner conflict. When we can resolve it, when we can integrate it, we are becoming whole again. We are clearing away the shadows to the heart. This is the path from the head to the heart. It's clearing away those shadows. That's the way I see it working. That's the way I see it working. Also, further to that, is that we've also forgotten about our body. When we're small, when we're taught in schools to start thinking. The shamans again, you get out of your feeling body. You feel the emotions. Your body feels the emotions and transmits it to your mind. And then you get into thought loops. You feel nervous, you can feel it in your body. We've forgotten our bodies as well. So heads to hearts to body. It's a beautiful place. That's to get the full person back. So there's gems to be found. When we find our inner conflict, if we can really reconnect with ourselves, there's some alchemy in that, the gold in the conflict. When we can do that for ourselves, we can do it for others. I think we were talking about that relational lawyering before. We can't relate to others unless we can relate to ourselves. It's the same thing. But this is the way I believe to do it. I've written a book about this recently. It's going to be launched next year, talking about how you as a person can connect back with your heart space and your feeling body by resolving your own shadows. When you resolve your own shadows, you come to the present moment. Because your shadows are formed in the past, you're always living in the past. When you have resolved those, you can be present. You can be open with your client. You can sit there, as Freud says, you can heal by listening. You can listen, you're present. Your heart space is there, you've created all this space for your client. Then it goes further because you can then show you, when your client comes before you, you can see their shadow and help them with too, without even knowing that they're healing. And instead of charging them for a fee to lose, they're winning. They're setting off at the alchemy and conflict. I love that. This is the best news for me. We are, as lawyers, we are seeing the conflict every day. Why can't we turn that into a gift? The gift it gives. Beautiful. That's pretty much my time today. So thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for watching.
Okay, Mothiur, have you been able to hear us?
Yes.
Okay, so Mothiur Rahman has had a number of roles. He's been a solicitor with one of the top firms in England. He then moved into advising on public law and public authority matters, especially environmental matters. He then has moved into more efforts to shape meaningful lives through ecological consciousness. And he's founded two organizations he may tell us about, the Community Chartering Network. And now he's set up a group called the New Economy Law, where he's a legal consultant to support clients with similar values. And we appreciate you going through the inconvenience of sitting on Skype and practicing earlier. And we're glad that you're here to talk to us, Mothiur. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the introduction. And yeah, wow, it's a pleasure just to join you here and to see all your faces and to feel connected across to the US, and that this is happening in the US. And you know, it'd be great to have something of similar scope and size here in the UK. And in fact, yeah, Peter and Nanette asked me, that was kind of the framing of a question, like, where do I see the seeds of a similar kind of movement growing in the UK? And so I've been thinking a little bit about it, and I just want to start with a quote by Professor Bodenheimer, who was in the 1960s, and writing very much against the legal positivism. He was a Harvard law professor. And it was this, he said, while a system of concepts and rules is necessary to guarantee the reign of law in society, it must always be kept in mind that such rules and concepts were created in order to meet the needs of life, and that care must be taken lest life be unnecessarily and senselessly forced into the straitjacket of an unnecessarily rigid order. And that was a book called Jurisprudence, The Philosophy and Method of the Law. And that sense, because I took a conversion route, so I didn't have legal jurisprudence as a kind of framework, but I do know about a little bit about legal positivism and that framing, and somehow having this other sense of history that could have been a different way, not this kind of natural justice methodology, which has been weakened. And I think there's something around that, around to frame how we look at law. And in a way, the work that I've been doing has been, without knowing the language, has been doing that. And there is a little diagram, which, I don't know if you've got the diagram with this two, like a donut shape. Yes, that's great. I can share my screen, actually. I'll try to see if I can see if this works here as well. Can you see that?
Yes.
Ah, great. So this was after, so the Community Chartering Network, which I've described here as CCN, it was a number of, we were working with a community in Scotland where they were facing unconventional gas extraction. And I was a planning lawyer, and a bit similar to what Virginia was mentioning, I had a bit of my own kind of transformation inside of like why, which is moving into the heart space, and in a way understanding, how do we bring love into law was a kind of an inquiry that I had. And being a planning lawyer and working with a number of other facilitators, education citizens who were looking for a different way in which that we could work with the law, I suddenly recognized that planning was a place where so much conflict happened between the citizens, between the developer, between the state, local authority, that it was a kind of a crucible in which that sense that that Virginia was talking about how we transform conflict and make it into and see ourselves that we are creating the conflict, and that for me was the action of love within that. And we created the concept of the community charter as a way of citizens coming together to describe what they love and what they care about, rather than to talk about what they're against, and to step into that place of understanding and shaping their own relationships with each other from a place of care. And the way we put that within the law was to say that the charter was an expression of the cultural heritage of the community, and cultural heritage within we have a European directive, Environmental Impact Assessment Directive, by which a project has to be assessed. And the assessment of the cultural heritage, their baseline data, it was only the usual way just to look at the tangible cultural heritage, national monuments, etc. But we were trying to broaden that to say that there is such a thing as intangible cultural heritage, and that this needs to be assessed, and there was an inadequate assessment of that. And we took that and many other arguments, the more sort of traditional arguments as well, around the scientific risks of fracking and unconventional gas extraction to a public inquiry. And we've been reflecting a lot upon the knowledge that we were trying to bring together, and what it was that we were trying to describe as cultural heritage. And we came to this idea described in this donut. And where I've mentioned the word lex, we call that lived experience. That is the embodied, creative relationship that is existing. But yet, what most of the law considers, and we've become so heady and abstracted, is the other circle. And I've mentioned, so it's the abstracted level of papers and documents that we think is the law, and it is the law that we work with. But in a way, we recognize that we're trying to work on two levels, and that's why we've got this. This was the key point, that we were working on two levels, not one. That we were both facing outwards to the forces, you could say the social forces of disinformation, socioeconomic, and authority, and in the governance ways of acting. But what the community was something very different. And when we looked inwards to that, we recognized we were needed to protect and nurture and nourish the lived experience of those people being together in their place. And that was what was often not nourished. And they were trying to struggle with those forces. And so we became we saw ourselves as a broker of that experience to nourish it, and also to be able to translate and express it outwards to the third parties. And so, in a way, for myself, what I began recognizing that this personal transformation that was very key and needed, there was all the social forces remain. The shadow, you could say, the shadow forces were within me that I had to struggle with and understand and see how what I was creating myself, but also that there's a collective social shadow as well, you could say, a shadow social force that remains in the world. And how do we work with that as lawyers, and how do we find the language to broker that? And that, yeah, what I'm coming to is that the sense of how do we bring both, and I know PISLAP's work was very much centered on the sort of social justice movement around with Martin Luther in the 60s. And so a contemporary a challenge that we're facing now is not just the social force, but also understanding that both our social rights, our human rights are all embraced within the global planetary boundaries, and that ecological boundary is something that we are only beginning to understand, inverting the way we look at human rights and social rights, and in the environment as an aspect of the economy, rather than seeing that all that the ecology is first, and all those rights are nourished by the ecology. And it's trying to bring both. So the work that I've been involved in is trying to see how those both connect, the work that is needed within ourselves individually, but also the more collective level. And in the chartering work, there is, and I'm finding a language in which we can express the spiritual qualities in a way that is describable in the world. And there is somebody we brought as a witness to our inquiry was Tom Crompton, who did a PhD on values and the meaning of philanthropy, and he's done a lot of academic work on the nature of values, and he's come to a sense of that there are universal values across all cultures, and he's mapped them and his work is called the Common Cause Foundation. And he did a lot of work with WWF in terms of framing of values and frames, how the language we use impacts upon how we then engage with the world. And so extrinsic values, which he calls values of mastery, and if we frame our language around that, such as you could say market-orientated thinking, often promotes these extrinsic values. And when you promote those values, it promotes separation within, it promotes the exact values that will cause us to separate from each other and see how we can control. So that's what his studies have shown. And so the intrinsic values need to be promoted, those which promote care, compassion, and the work. So the Charter, in a way, is trying to promote that sense of our those intrinsic values, to put that first, to nourish the soil of our collective inner lives, our social and ecological capital, you could say. And I know there is a lot of connection both in myself and in a lot of the indigenous wisdom that Virginia was also talking about. I've been very influenced by Pat McCabe, who is a Navajo elder. Who I was doing a master's at a place called Schumacher College in Devon, and they promote a holistic science model and a lot of wisdom from indigenous communities. And she came to the college to speak of her understanding that there needed to be a global healing, that what she called the hoop of life had been broken because the understanding of right relation had been damaged through a way of looking at life which had not understood how the interconnectedness, the deep interconnectedness of the earth. And she spoke about both the sacred feminine knowledge that needed to be nourished. But what was key for me was that she took the men to one side, and we had a workshop, and she said to us, the men, that we men, as well as having the sacred, both men and women had the feminine and masculine in them, but she was saying that the men were also damaged and shamed in the sense that all they understood was the shadow masculine, that there was no real understanding of what the masculine without its shadow element could be in the world. And that struck a massive chord in me, because I had moved away from, because I don't see that in the world at all. And so I didn't even know there was a language for the masculine without its shadow element. But to see that there could be was my own personal inquiry, to find out what could the masculine be without its shadow element in the world, the toxic element, which we see so much in the world right now. And how could we transform the shadow masculine that survived both in myself and in society in a way to bring out the qualities of the masculine without that shadow element? And in a way, for me, it's as a lawyer, it's how to bring a spiritual problem into a world that doesn't see spirit as a public problem. And I guess the foundations of secularism, in a way, because of it connects a lot to my own understanding of after Brexit and so on, trying to connect with why there is so much anti-Muslim discourse at the moment, and seeing that secularism separated this on the fights that the West or Europe had around the church and under the church as a worldly power. And so secularism separated that in a way, like the private world and spirit was for the private, but worldly power was for parliament and politics and so on. So there's been this kind of separation, and it's a difficulty and a challenge to see how to bring the qualities of spirit back into the public world. And for myself, the way we've beginning to frame it in our chartering work is to say, where are the sites of engagement and agency in the world? And we see the state as one power. So the public. So being a public lawyer, lawyer in public law, I see that the public interest, the idea of the public interest. I used to see the state as both the same thing, and it was Brexit that began to see that actually the state interest and the public interest don't always match, and the state has its own interest. And so where else could the public interest be nourished or be brought out when the state interest is moving away? And the markets have their own logic, their own, and that the business mentality. And NGOs, you could say, and campaigners working in professionalized NGOs have their own professional way of working. And so through the chartering work, I saw there was another site of engagement and agency as civil society. And this was also when I mentioned in the briefing, this conference on transnational justice really brought to my mind that international law was the law between nation states, and nation states themselves being a legal concept. After the Peace of Westphalia and so much, I've just done a bit of reading around. So that idea of the state, and he was talking about, well, this conference was about transnational justice, about what law, how do we interrogate the state as a power, as a site of power, and look trans meaning beyond, so beyond the state. And for me, civil society and these actions of communities coming together to say that the law isn't protecting them, for me, that was a site of power and agency to bring this sense of their values, because they were coming from a place of values and understanding that they wanted their values to be brought out into the public world. And so that's how I see PISLAP's movement of civil rights movement now moving into kind of, like you could say, a socio-ecological movement of people trying to come together to protect the earth. And just a few days ago, the IPCC.
Mothiur, can you see me? This is Bruce.
Oh yes.
We're going to need to move on in just a couple minutes, and I'd like to give a chance if people have some questions.
Sorry, yes, I've probably taken up too much time. Yes. So just to finish then on the IPCC report has just said that the governments have a moral duty to act, that there's now 12 years within which to prevent climate change. So to go beyond 3 degrees, so that 12-year period now is here. And there is a movement in the UK around conscientious protectors that Polly Higgins has been bringing out, that there's a right under Article 9, the freedom of conscience. And that is what she's trying to bring. And to wrap that up, I've noticed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it talks about that human beings are endowed with both reason and conscience. And that understanding of conscience is something that, as a moral, that is our moral sense, needs to be, I feel, needs to be brought out as well as our reason. And so those are the seeds in which I begin to see in the UK that there is a movement called Rising Up, which is trying to work with communities around civil disobedience on an ecological space, and we're working with them. The Conscious Lawyer magazine, which is gathering lawyers together around new understandings of the law, that I think has been released with PISLAP. The fact-free group movements I've been working with, and there's a bishop who's been doing a lot of work around that. So that's where I see the spiritual element also coming in there. And there was a wild law conference as well, which is also bringing lawyers together around this ecological governance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mothiur. We need to take a brief break before our next speaker at 2, but why don't we maybe limit to 2 questions for Virginia or Mothiur? Anybody have any thoughts? Yes. An AU law student would like to ask a question.
Yeah, I'm wondering, why don't you use the mic? Oh.
Is that one on? Here, just.
Does that work? Thank you. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the concept of masculinity without a shadow, and specifically how women in kind of encouraging the expression of their femininity can still be helpful partners and encouraging. I think the two go hand in hand, but I feel like a lot of public conversations around femininity tend to empower the female, sometimes at the expense of the male. So how do you empower both side by side?
Did you hear that okay?
It was kind of like reverberating a little bit, so I couldn't quite.
How do you empower the male shadow along with the female without overweighting the female aspects?
Yeah. Big question. Yeah.
Yeah. Go up and sit here.
Hi, sorry.
Oh, hi there.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the masculinity, expressing the masculinity without the shadow, how women can be helpful partners, because a lot of conversations publicly about femininity tend to be, female empowerment with a strong distrust of men. So how can both be empowered in collaboration with each other? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm part of a men's group, actually, which is it's called the Mankind Project, and it is a space where men have been getting together to understand their own toxicity and their own emotions, but also to understand that they do have feelings. They don't have to repress them. And I think that is the first step that we saw with Pat McCabe, was that men need to come together to understand themselves first and to have a clarity about themselves, because women have been doing this work for much longer. And when men